Welcome to this lecture and to the next 23, which will address what Christians call the Old Testament and what Jews call the Tanakh, which I'll explain in a minute. But by the very fact we've got two different definitions and two different communities of faith, already we can see that there are a variety of matters that we can express, controversial issues, method of approach. This is a difficult subject area, a complex subject area. So how do we enter? Let's begin with just a general description of the contents of the text, the centuries it covers, the genres it represents, and then a word or two on the methods that biblical scholars in both church and synagogue on the one hand and the academy, secular institutions on the other, bring to bear on this material to try to figure out both what it meant in its original context and what it means according to contemporary forms of interpretation. Once this basic information gets out on the table, then we can start where the Bible starts, in the beginning, as it were, and use the first chapter of the first book, Genesis, as a test case to figure out what questions we might bring to this material, how to ask those questions, and what methods might help us unpack what those biblical authors were trying to convey. So let's begin in terms of contents. There's a lot of stuff here. The biblical material spans the creation of the world in Genesis chapter 1 up to what happens to the Jewish community in the wake of Alexander the Great. In other words, we're looking at everything from creation on down, a spectacular and staggering amount of material. Now, although dating the creation of the world is something that occupies, say, evolutionists and creationists and people interested in what to put in public school textbooks, it's not something that the Bible itself is concerned about. The initial chapters of Genesis are not concerned with history per se. They're not setting out there to say, this is how evolution occurred, this is a particular date on which this happened. Rather, the earliest materials are myth. In terms of the dating, when were they first written down? Some of this material may stem from the early Bronze Age or the Middle Bronze Age, sometime around 2000 to 1800 BC or BCE, and we'll come back to those dates in a minute. In terms of actual written materials, perhaps the first transcriptions, when that oral material was actually transcribed into writing, perhaps around, the Iron Age, the year 1000, maybe 900 or so. Some biblical scholars will put this transcription at the court of King David, about the year 900. Other biblical scholars, and here I count myself among them, are not quite sure whether King David actually existed or not. He may be more like King Arthur, a figure of myth and saga, rather than someone whose historicity can actually be located. I would be more inclined to put the writing of this material, the earliest material, sometime maybe around 750 or so, when we can actually trace out an Israelite monarchy. And as we go through these lectures, I'll let you know at what time period we are, who the kings are, what is happening in terms of the culture, and where in the ancient Near East we can match up what the Bible says and what other texts and what archaeological evidence shows us. For each period, this collection, as you can already tell, offers a span of literary considerations, which brings us to the question of genre. Among the genres we will encounter at the beginning are cosmological myths, which is just a fancy way of saying myths of origin. How did the world get started? Why are we here? Who is the God who created the world? And what are we supposed to be doing with our lives? That's the material in what's called the primeval history, or Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Most people are familiar in general with this information, the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark and the universal flood, the Tower of Babel. Again, all mythological materials. Not only does this mythological information help us understand what ancient Israel thought of itself, this material provides remarkable cross-cultural comparison. The myths and the histories of Israel are not written in a vacuum. They're written in dialogue, sometime in competition with other literatures in the ancient Near East, Babylonian stories, Assyrian stories, Egyptian stories, and later on in the text, Greek stories. So we will do a fair amount of cross-cultural comparison to watch how Israel defines itself in relation to its neighbors. Once we complete the mythological materials, we'll move into stories of some of the culture heroes that we find in Genesis, people such as Abraham, and in Exodus, for example, Moses, and we'll move up into the period of the Judges where we find heroes such as Samson. But we now have more historical problems. With myth, we can make tentative guesses on when those myths were written. But when we get up to more historical figures like Abraham or Joshua or Moses or Samson, we then have to ask more specific historical questions. Are these real people? Does the Bible record what actually happened? Did the walls really fall down when Joshua blew the trumpets at Jericho? Did Moses really stand up on a mountain and get a law of some sort? Were there really Israelites enslaved in Egypt? And we have to do history very cautiously here because the vast majority of this early material has no ancient Near Eastern literary or archaeological support. So who then is telling these stories, and to what effect? Are they real stories? Are they legends? Are they a combination? And why would ancient Israel tell these particular stories? When we think about some of these characters, Samson is frankly stupid. Why would they tell a story about a hero who's plain dumb? Abraham is a trickster, and as we'll see in the next couple of lectures, he does things like pass his wife off as his sister and place her in harems of foreign kings, which is frankly not nice. But he's the father of this people, the father of the Hebrews. Why tell these stories about him? The genres continue past these culture heroes into laws. In the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which together with the book of Genesis comprise the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is simply a Greek term for five, penta, and tuchos means scrolls. The five scrolls, sometimes called the Book of Moses. The Pentateuch is replete with legal material. We might think of the Ten Commandments. Those are fairly familiar to most people. They're these days touchstones for politicians. But beyond questions like honor your father and mother, which I think is a great idea, and don't commit adultery and don't murder, the Bible is replete with other law codes which require much more investigation. Dietary regulations, laws about how to plant your crops, tort law, laws about how to run a cult. Why are they there? What effect did they have? And how do those laws in general show how ancient Israel considered itself to be a community in covenant? And covenant is simply a legal contract between itself and God. How are these laws the terms of that contract? The genres continue. We then move up into the prophetic literature. Normally today when we think about prophets, we think about people who predict the future, people like Nostradamus or Edgar Cayce or Jean Dixon or whoever writes those horoscope columns in the newspaper. But the biblical prophets are not predictors of the far-flung future. To the contrary, they're actually astute political and social critics who tell the people, and often the king or the head of the cult, the priests, if you continue to behave in the way that you are behaving, bad things will happen. That's not necessarily divine intuition. One can normally tell if society continues on a certain road, disaster will happen. The prophets are interested in social justice, and that's much of what they're known for. But the prophets are also interested in political policy. They advise kings when to make foreign alliances and when to remain isolationists. They're interested in the cult, how to run the cult, how to offer sacrifices, how personal interior thought and repentance relates to exterior action. Is it sufficient simply to offer up a bull as a sacrifice without being in a right relationship with your neighbor? So prophets are much more than predictors and more than social critics and more than political analysts. They're fantastic poets who use arresting images and exquisite phrasing in order to get their message across. Because if one is a prophet, one cannot simply get up on a soapbox, which they didn't have back then, but bear with me on that. You just can't get up on a soapbox and say, behave yourselves, because nobody's going to listen. So you have to do it in a way that's going to gain the attention of the people who are supposed to be listening to you. And you have to do it in such a way that people will remember what you said and write down what you said. Part of the extraordinary aspect of ancient Israel is they wrote down material that criticizes, heavily criticizes, what they actually did. This is a community that's very interested in making itself better by recognizing what it did that was wrong to begin with. The genres continue past the prophets. Whereas the prophets talk about how to conduct business in, say, the cult or in politics, we also have a genre known as wisdom literature, which explains how to conduct business in the marketplace or among the upper classes. This is literature like Proverbs, which tells you how to behave. But it's also literature that raises those profound questions that philosophers and theologians have yet to resolve. We have, for example, the book of Job, which asks, in effect, if God is a righteous God, why is Job suffering? Why do the wicked prosper? Why do the good endure pain and death and exile? And whether whether Job actually resolves that problem or not is something scholars can continue to debate. I think, in fact, Job provides an answer, but it may not be the answer most people think is there. We'll have to wait. The later books of the canon move to novellae, short stories like Ruth and Jonah, which explore in an extremely entertaining way how Israel is to relate to its neighbors. Ruth, the hero of her book, is a Moabite, one of the traditional enemies of Israel, and yet Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of the famous King David. Jonah, who's probably the only prophet whose audience actually listened to him, which is interesting, is commissioned to go speak to the people of Nineveh in Assyria, Israel's major enemy. Jonah doesn't want to go. He doesn't want the Assyrians to listen to him. But what is this text telling us about Assyrian repentance? And then we move on. We find court tales, stories of Jews, queens, courtiers who find themselves in royal courts outside of Israel, in the diaspora, which simply means the dispersion. Court tales like the book of Esther, the great Jewish queen who manages to save her people from certain genocide. Or the story of Daniel, who finds himself in both Babylonian and Persian courts and has to fight to retain his identity, given pressures on him to assimilate, to eat food which is not permitted according to his religious laws, to pray in a manner that is not permitted according to his religious ideals. So what these court tales do is provide instruction to Jews on how to live in the diaspora, how to live when Greek culture comes in, how to live when cultural pressures come upon them. How do you retain your identity? What do you give into? What makes you, you? Which is a problem people in covenant communities have today. For Jews and Christians who want to obey the law, how much do we give into secular society? And how much do we attempt to retain our independent, unique identity? The problems that the Bible raises are problems that will always continue. We end with apocalyptic visions, the end of the book of Daniel. Questions like, when does righteousness ever show up? Who is the Messiah, and when can we tell that he's arrived? What happens at the end of time? Is there a resurrection of the dead? Does God make everything good again? And if so, how and when? And throughout, we encounter storytellers and lawmakers and bureaucrats and priests and prophets and scribes and visionaries, and they all wrote for different audiences in different times using different literary genres. They don't always agree with each other, and we may not agree with them either. That's part of the glory of this text. But in terms of appreciating it, not only must we appreciate the diversity of all this material, we also have to have a multifaceted approach. I've always thought that biblical studies, or religion in general, is the perfect undergraduate major because it requires knowledge, a little bit at least, of everything else one learns, at least in the humanities and social sciences. Literary criticism, anthropology, economics, political science, history, art, anthropology, mythology, cross-cultural studies, it's all there. For example, deeper evaluation of the biblical materials requires the recognition that what was normative in antiquity, slavery, animal sacrifice, wandering from place to place, a lack of urban environments to begin with, a God who talks to people on a day-to-day basis. What was normative then is not normative now. So one thing we need to do in biblical studies is try to make all that strange material familiar, to try to develop a sympathy for these people who live in a world much different than ours. But at the same time, there's a good much of this material which is extremely familiar to most people, if not through religious backgrounds, then at least through what they've gained through art history or watching movies. Therefore, we also need to make some of that familiar stuff a little bit more strange. What are some of those modern connections? Oh, Steinbeck's East of Eden, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, Faulkner's Absalom. Did they get it right? And how much do we read into the biblical text what we've heard in our own culture? Right? If you've seen some of those Bible movies, The Sword and Sandals, Gregory Peck, for example, as King David, the David and Bathsheba movies are actually quite different than what the Bible has to say. So we need to look at the Bible as if it is fresh to us, as if we can bracket all those cultural concerns. And in terms of some of these concerns, we also have religious history because Jews and Christians and even Muslims have been interpreting this material for well over 2,000 years. So we also need to consider in a sensitive way how religious confession, religious history impacts this material. A brief word then on religion and biblical studies. Biblical studies ought not to provide a negative to one's religious faith. If one comes to this material from a faith perspective, ideally, the academic study of the Bible should enhance one's faith rather than destroy it. For example, if one wants to believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, then I think it behooves that person to know as much as possible about when it was written, where it was written, and to whom it was written. In other words, if God decided to inspire this text, it makes a difference that it was inspired to ancient Israelites rather than people in, say, contemporary Washington, D.C. or Tennessee. But sometimes the biblical material will provide information which seems counter to at least more traditional views of faith. Because sometimes when we look at this material, particularly in light of ancient Near Eastern evidence, we find that the Bible is not necessarily recording history. Archaeology comes in here as well. The Promised Land, as it's been called, has yielded numerous archaeological sites. But it turns out that the promise of archaeology often yields material that is controversial. It is doubtful that Jerusalem was David's major capital, because at the time David ostensibly ruled, Jerusalem, so archaeologists tell us, is just a small little hovel. It's not a major city. It's doubtful that Joshua brought down the walls of Jericho, because at the time Joshua ostensibly got there, Jericho was already a ruined city. So how then does archaeology help us? And why, if archaeology tells us, as best as it can, that the stories the Bible records are not always history as it happened, how then do we understand what the biblical writer is doing? Is the biblical writer conveying something other than history? The ever-growing discoveries of history from the ancient Near East, not only through archaeology, but also through literature, also help us. We have philological investigation to help us interpret the words of the Bible better. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew with a couple of books and chapters in Aramaic. But the more we know about ancient Near Eastern Hebrew and Aramaic, the better translators we can be. Finally, there's literary concerns. Because as I noted, the Bible is also a work of literature. There's narrative art here, and not just with the prophets. We might think of modern works of history or biography. There are good biographies and there are bad biographies, and they might all have the same amount of information. Good biographies are well written. They carry a plot line. They drag us along so that inexorably we keep reading. And the same thing with good histories. There are conventions here. And it's the same thing with the Bible. We need to recognize its aesthetic value. The Bible, for example, uses literary conventions all the time. They're called type scenes. They're replays of the same scenes. Literary conventions are today easy to note. Even my children, who are 14 and 10, know what a convention is because they know what a situation comedy is, and they know what cartoons are supposed to do, and they actually know what westerns are. The ancient Near East and the biblical writers had conventions as well. Our problem is we don't live then, obviously. We need to determine what those conventions are to see how a lot of the biblical material would have been extremely familiar to its ancient audiences. It is as if we are eavesdropping on ancient material. And that's part of the fun. Now, one final comment before we get into the text. The biblical text has been used by different communities of faith for different reasons. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are different names for this text, and in fact, the books fall into different orders. There is the Old Testament, which is a Christian designation. The Old Testament begins with Genesis, and then, if you're a Protestant, it ends with the prophets. The last book in the Old Testament is the prophet Malachi, who predicts the coming of the prophet Elijah. Elijah, you may remember, is the prophet who never actually dies, but goes up in a heavenly chariot. This is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Well, Elijah is actually the one who got into it and went up to heaven. The idea is he will come back before the great day of the Lord, as the prophet Malachi puts it, to bring about the kingdom of God, which is lovely if you happen to be a Christian, because then you can go in the Protestant canon directly from Malachi's prediction of the return of Elijah and the coming of the kingdom right to the Gospels, where at the beginning of the Gospels, John the Baptist is Elijah come back, and Jesus announces the kingdom. Now, if you're part of the Catholic or Orthodox communion, you still have an Old Testament, but the ending is not quite with Malachi. The Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox and Catholic canons also include a second collection of books called either the Old Testament Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical writings. These are books like The Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach or the Book of Judith. Most of this material is interspersed among the other books in the Old Testament canon, but at the end of the Orthodox and Catholic canon, we have additional histories, for example, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The irony here is 1st and 2nd Maccabees provide us the story of Hanukkah, celebrated in Judaism, but the books are not part of Judaism's canon. Judaism's canon is called the Tanakh, which is simply an acronym, TNK. Torah, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the prophets, in Hebrew, Nevi'im, and the prophets in the Hebrew Bible include both some historical works, such as Joshua, Samuel, and Kings, as well as the prophets we normally think of, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 minor prophets like Hosea and Amos. And then the book ends with the K, the Ketuvim, the writings, books like Esther and Jonah. The last book in the Tanakh is 2nd Chronicles, and it ends with the edict of King Cyrus of Persia in the 5th century, telling the people in exile in Babylon, God has commissioned me, Cyrus, to send you home and to build you a temple back in Jerusalem. Let anyone who is able go up, make aliyah, as they say in Hebrew, go back home. So the Christian Old Testament ends with the promise of the new, and the Jewish Tanakh ends with a call, go back home, start again, get it right this time. Different texts. And of course, this material can be referred to not only as the Old Testament or the Tanakh, it can also be called the Bible or even the Hebrew Scriptures, and I'm going to use all of them. When we look at this material, we find different chapters and verses. Don't let those throw you. The chapters and verses were put in the Middle Ages in order to make biblical research easier. But it is often the case that chapters and even verse divisions split a text where perhaps the original author and certainly the literary critic does not think that text should be split. There's a perfect example of this in the first book of Genesis. The original creation story ends not at the end of chapter 1, but in chapter 2, verse 4a. We might look at that a little bit later. So here we are. Let's move into the text because it's more fun when we can actually get in there. Let's start. Genesis 1:1 starts in the beginning, or perhaps better translated, when in the beginning. That's closer to what the Hebrew says. If we do a little bit of cross-cultural comparison, we find that Genesis chapter 1 is likely a response to the Babylonian creation myth, which is called the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish begins when on high. So we have when in the beginning versus when on high. Moreover, the Hebrew cosmogony, the Hebrew story of origins, ends with God resting on the 7th day. God rested on the 7th day from all his work, hallowed the 7th day, and therefore we have a day of rest. From in the beginning to the seventh day, the biblical cosmogony talks about time and makes time sacred. The Enuma Elish begins when on high. There's a specific place. And it ends with the founding of the Babylonian capital, space. What does this mean? Genesis chapter 1 was probably written by Jews in exile in Babylon. The Enuma Elish is the myth of the conquering kingdom. So what the authors of Genesis 1 are trying to do is say, wait a minute, we have our own God, our own story, and we will privilege time rather than space, because that's actually what makes sense when you're in exile, when you're apart from your temple, apart from your capital, and apart from your land. At least you can keep the Sabbath, you can mark the days, and recognize that each one is good. Genesis chapter 1 is more than simply a story of origins. It's a story that shows how people define themselves amid an alien culture. Moving on in Genesis, it even gets better. Let's go back to the Enuma Elish for a minute. In the Enuma Elish, we encounter two gods of water. One, a male god whose name is Apsu, is the god of fresh water. And the more important god, Tiamat, it's actually a goddess, is the goddess of salt water. And they represent primeval chaos. We have that same primeval chaos in Genesis chapter 1, where the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the deep. And the word for deep in Hebrew is tom, which sounds awfully like Tiamat. Except in the Enuma Elish, the deep, the watery chaos, they're gods. But in the Bible, these are not gods, there's only one. And chaos is simply chaos, as the Bible puts it. Tohu wavohu, without form and void. Well, it turns out in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, that there's a younger generation of gods, and they decide to go to war with their parents. Nothing much changes in history. The younger gods are led by the god called Marduk, and Marduk goes to war particularly against Tiamat. She's the most recalcitrant. Eventually, he gets the aid of 7 gods of wind, and he basically blows Tiamat up. She becomes this huge wind-filled bag, at which point he kills her and splits her body open, and with the top part of her body makes a vault. This is the Bible's firmament. And with the bottom part of her body makes the earth. Now, what do we have in Genesis? Genesis continues, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. But the word spirit, ruach in Hebrew, can also mean wind. So here we have the 7 wind gods in the Enuma Elish, and the wind of God hovering over the face of the deep. And what does God do? God decides to separate the waters above from the waters below, make organization out of chaos, and creates a vault of heaven and a vault of the earth. It's the same story. But here there's no war between the gods. Here's one singular God, not manipulating matter, but creating by word of his mouth, saying, let it be that. This is great. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk decides to create humanity out of the blood of a dead god, and humanity is created to be slaves to Marduk and all of his buddies. In the Babylonian view, with the exception of the king, everybody worked for the gods, which basically meant worked for the king. In the biblical tradition, God says, let us make man in our own image. In the image of God, he created him. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. We are not created to be slaves of the gods. We are created to be in the image of God. And indeed, in the biblical text, we are given dominion over the birds and the fish and the creepy crawly things and the entire world, to be fruitful and multiply and subdue it. This is an extraordinary text. And not just because it's a comparative myth to the Enuma Elish. It tells us that we are creatures to be appreciated. It tells us that God, in his royal court, that's why God speaks in the plural, let us. It tells us that God has pre-planned us. God takes counsel and creates us. It tells us that male and female are equal, both in the image of God. And it sets us forward to a world that God has said is good. Because when God finished creating in Genesis 1, God saw that everything was good. Unfortunately, in Genesis chapter 2, things start going downhill, where we get stories of Adam and Eve and that nasty snake and the fall from Eden, fratricide with Cain and Abel, world cruelty with Noah, people trying to build a tower to storm heaven with the Tower of Babel. For some people, this creates a problem. Genesis 1 is good, Genesis 2 and 3 are bad. For some, these are different stories. For some, they flow naturally, one right into the other. But we'll have to look at Lecture 2 to see how that works.